blood, science, and change. The first time Jonah Mercer realized his body had become political territory, he was half-dressed, underfed, and losing an argument with a medical scanner. "This is humiliating," he muttered. "It is diagnostic," said healer Sarah Smear. "That is not a contradiction." The examination chamber aboard the Umbralith was cleaner than any human hospital Jonah had ever seen, and somehow more unnerving for it. Nothing clattered. Nothing beeped. The equipment did not crowd the room so much as inhabit it. Curved black glass columns rising from the floor, pale interfaces blooming at gesture touch, suspended rings of silver light that moved soundlessly around the body when activated. Even the air felt intentional, cool and faintly mineral, absent the antiseptic harshness he associated with human medicine. Jonah stood barefoot on a circular platform of dark stone, while 3 bands of light rotated slowly from ankle to throat. The scars across his chest and ribs, finer now, paler than they had been even a week ago, caught and returned the glow in narrow lines. Sarah stood at one console, violet eyes narrowed in concentration. Beside her, older and more severe, stood archivist-physician Valor Riss. Jonah had met him only once before, briefly, in the early haze of recovery, but the man had not become any less unsettling with clarity. Valor looked like a cathedral had taken offense and learned anatomy. His skin had faded toward near white with age, the kind of age that no longer cared how youth felt about it. His hair was silver, worn bound at the nape. His eyes, pale and precise, missed nothing and forgave less. Nicera waited by the door, outwardly calm. Kalis leaned against a far wall, pretending she was not present as security. Maven sat at a side station, already reviewing data she had no formal reason to understand, which meant she understood it better than everyone else for strategic purposes. Elson, after lengthy argument, had not been allowed to attend. Jonah suspected this was wise, mostly because if children heard phrases like anomalous adaptation, cellular variance, and unprecedented compatibility too often, they either panicked or developed ambitions. Cirrus made a subtle motion with 2 fingers. The rotating light bands shifted color from silver to a pale blue-white. "Remain still," she said. Jonah looked down at himself. "I'm standing inside a glowing cage while a scholar vampire examines my bloodstream. Stillness has become one of my more accessible virtues." Valor did not look up from the hovering readout before him. "Humor," he said in a voice like dry stone, "is frequently the body's least helpful response to uncertainty." Jonah folded his arms. "That sounds like a professional opinion reached after decades of being deeply enjoyable company." Kalis made a choking sound that might have been laughter. Saris's mouth twitched. Valor finally lifted his eyes. For one very long second, Jonah thought he might be vaporized by scholarship alone. Then the elder physician said, "He is irritating, but the wit remains structurally intact." Nicera's expression did not change, but Jonah caught the smallest shift at the corner of her mouth. Cirrus gestured, and the bands of light slowed to a halt. She touched the display before her, expanding a lattice of symbols Jonah could not read. And beneath them, what looked suspiciously like a cellular model. "We have completed the 3rd comparative scan," she said. "The results confirm progression." Jonah straightened slightly. "Progression toward what exactly?" Valor answered. "That," he said, "is what has become inconveniently difficult to define." The room went still, not because anyone was frightened, because everyone there recognized the shape of the sentence. Something once strange had become stranger with evidence. Cirrus turned the model so Jonah could see. He recognized nothing about it at first. Interlinked branching structures, pulsing nodes, color-shifting fields along membrane-like boundaries. Then Cirrus highlighted one segment. "This is a baseline human cell matrix," she said. "This is yours from archival intake on Bastion Reach, 4 standard months prior to the attack." A second version of the model appeared beside the first. It looked similar, then not. The outer structures were denser, the interior response channels brighter. Some portions of the cellular membrane seemed to have grown additional resilience along stress lines. Cirrus touched the altered model. "And this is yours now." Jonah stared at it. "Those are different." "Yes," said Cirrus. He looked at Valor. "How different?" The old physician moved one hand. Several diagnostic values expanded into long columns. In human terms, he said, alarmingly. Jonah inhaled once. That is not a medical unit. It is when the medicine is offended. Mevin, without looking up, said, translate. Valor gave her a look suggesting he did not appreciate being ordered inside a sovereign medical chamber by a strategist masquerading as furniture. Then he answered anyway. Your body, he said to Jonah, did not merely recover from trauma. It adapted through it. Jonah's gaze returned to the cellular models. He thought of the first conversation with Saris and Valor after waking, of hints about resilience, altered response, compatibility, of Maven's warning that his survival had raised questions. Back then, the language had still allowed comfort, anomaly, monitoring, possibility. This felt less like possibility and more like trespass into the known. I'm still human, he said. It was not quite a question. Valor's pale eyes held his. Yes, Jonah breathed out. Then Valor added, but the category now contains more detail than it did before. There it was, no melodrama, no monstrous revelation, nothing crude enough to turn into campfire fear, only a disciplined scientist saying the border had moved. Saris enlarged another segment of the display. The harmonic chemotherapy that stabilized you should not have produced adaptive retention, she said. Human tissue normally accepts repair and returns as nearly as possible to baseline. Your cells did not return, they incorporated. Jonah frowned. Incorporated what? This time Saris and Valor exchanged a glance. Not uncertainty. Decision. At last Saris said, response logic. He blinked. That sounds fake. It is not fake, Valor said dryly. It is merely not language your species has needed. Nicera pushed off the wall fractionally. Make it plainer. Saris inclined her head. Valdir regenerative medicine is not passive, she said. It does not impose correction on the body from above. It enters into signal dialogue with living tissue, damage recognition, structural recall, adaptive reinforcement, metabolic redirection. Our cells respond to this deeply because our bodies evolved. She glanced once at Jonah, or were altered through long historical conditions that favored such responsiveness. Jonah followed most of that, if not all, and mine answered. Yes. Because of the plasma trauma? In part, Saris said. The scale of damage forced whole-body emergency signaling. Under ordinary treatment thresholds, no human system would remain coherent long enough for meaningful adaptation. You should have died before integration was possible. Jonah rubbed one hand over his mouth. Always, somehow, the explanation circled back to that. You should have died. And because he had not, every category around him now had administrative trouble. Maven stood and came closer to the display. What specifically has changed? Valor's answer was immediate. Thermal resilience, recovery efficiency, reflex transmission speed, microvascular reconstruction under stress, and most significantly, he paused. Jonah felt his spine tighten, cross-frequency receptivity. Silence. Kalis uncrossed her arms. Say that in soldier. Valor looked as though soldier was a dialect he disapproved of but tolerated for wartime necessity. It means, he said, that his body now receives certain Valdir bioharmonic cues with measurable effect. Jonah stared. Saris nodded once. Not all, not even most, but enough to matter. No one spoke for a moment. Then Jonah said the obvious thing. My body is learning to respond to yours. Valor folded his hands behind his back. That is one coarse but acceptable rendering. Kalis muttered something in Valdir. Maven's eyes were already unfocused with implication. Nicera remained very still, which Jonah had learned meant she was thinking at a depth dangerous to simpler conversations. Jonah looked again at the cellular displays. Blood, science, and change. He could almost hear the chapter title of his own bad luck. What does that mean practically? He asked. Am I stronger, faster, secretly nocturnal? About to start writing dramatic poetry? Tila said that last symptom would justify immediate quarantine. To Jonah's surprise, Saris answered the joke rather than the science first. No dramatic poetry has yet been observed, she said. Then she turned serious. Practically, it means the changes remain subtle but cumulative. Your healing rate has accelerated beyond human expectation. Your muscular recovery under controlled strain exceeds baseline projections. Your reflex arc during training has shortened measurably over the last 9 sessions. We believe that under certain conditions, your body now interprets stress not only as damage, but as instruction. Jonah looked at Nicera. You heard all that? I heard that Kalis has been right to keep hitting you. Kalis looked insufferably satisfied. I hate all of you, Jonah said. No, Maven replied. You are merely outnumbered by accuracy. He turned back to Cirrus. And this threatens the Ashen Creed. How? That drew every eye in the room. Because of course that was where he went. Not what does this make me first? Who will fear it? Maven's expression altered by a degree so slight most would have missed it. But Jonah saw it now, the strategist recognizing alignment. Valor, interestingly, answered with something like respect. It threatens them, the old physician said, because biology is harder to argue with than morality. Jonah went still. There it was. The next battlefield. Not the market now, not the court, not even doctrine alone, the body. The creed could sneer at mercy as softness. They could frame sacrifice as weakness, treaty as dilution, compassion as fear dressed in silk. But if a human body could survive Valdir treatment at impossible thresholds, if it could respond, adapt, integrate, if the old biological divisions between species were not as absolute as purity theology required, then the creed did not just face moral contradiction, they faced ontological collapse. Cirrus gave voice to the thought. The Ashen Creed teaches that blood determines moral and civilizational destiny, she said. Not merely culturally, structurally. They require the line between human and Valdir to remain spiritually and biologically hierarchical. And if my cells disagree, Jonah said softly, their doctrine starts to rot from underneath. Yes, said Cirrus. Nicera stepped closer to the display. How widely do we know this? Within this room, the sovereign household, and 2 sealed medical archives, Cirrus said. No further. Keep it that way, Nicera said at once. Maven nodded. Until we decide whether secrecy protects him or endangers him. Jonah glanced between them. That's reassuring. It is not meant to be, Maven said. Valor moved one hand and the cellular models disappeared, replaced by a more human-looking skeletal muscular projection of Jonah himself. Scars lit in gold, stress channels in silver, reflex arcs in blue. You are still in active change, Valor said. That matters. This is not a completed condition. It may plateau, it may deepen, it may destabilize, we do not know. Jonah stared at the image of his own body suspended in light like a blueprint of uncertain allegiance. You really don't know? No, said Cirrus. That honesty unnerved him more than polished certainty would have. He looked up. What are the risks? Valor answered this time without delay. Overstrain could force maladaptive reinforcement. Exposure to improperly tuned harmonic treatment could damage more than repair. If the Creed learned of this, they would likely seek either to destroy you before the evidence matures or capture you for doctrinal manipulation and experimentation. Jonah nodded once, slow and grim. There it is. Kalis pushed away from the wall fully now. Then we stopped speaking about this as though it is an abstract curiosity. It is not spoken of that way, Cirrus said. It sounds like that when scholars are afraid to use the word target. Valor's eyes narrowed. He is not merely a target. He is. He stopped, not because he lacked the next word, because he disliked it. Jonah, unfortunately, already knew. A specimen. The room went cold. Cirrus's head snapped toward him. No, Jonah met her gaze. That's what this becomes if we're not careful. Valor said nothing, which was answer enough. Cirrus stepped toward Jonah. That is not how I regard you. I know, he said, but I also know how quickly bodies turn into arguments when history gets interested. No one moved. He had not meant to say it harshly, only truly. And truth in this ship had developed a habit of landing where people least wanted it. At length, Elira's voice entered the room from the doorway. That is why the body must remain attached to the person. Everyone turned. She had entered silently enough that even Kalis had not noticed. High Matriarch Elira Valathorn stood at the threshold in a dark house gown without crown or escort, though 2 shadow guards were visible farther back in the corridor. Her golden eyes moved first to Jonah, then to the frozen displays, then to Cirrus and Valor. No one spoke until she crossed the room. Majesty, Cirrus said, bowing. Elira inclined her head. Continue standing. I am not here for ritual. She came to the display and regarded the projection of Jonah's lit skeleton for a long moment. Explain it, she said. Cirrus did, this time more succinctly, more clinically. The facts without cushioning language. Adaptive retention, harmonic receptivity, ongoing change, potential compatibility implications, creed exposure risk. Elira listened without interrupting. When Cirrus finished, the matriarch rested one hand against the edge of the console. So, she said quietly, the creed's fear is no longer only symbolic. Maven answered, no. Severn was not here, Jonah noticed. That meant either the matter was still being contained or Elira had come before military framing could harden. He was not sure which possibility unsettled him more. Elira looked at Jonah then. How are you bearing this? Not. Are you all right? Not the meaningless gentleness of rulers who ask after pain only when it has already become useful. How are you bearing this? Jonah let out a breath through his nose. I'm somewhere between scientifically alarmed and offended on principle. A flicker, again, at the corner of her mouth. Specific. I try. She studied him another second. Then turned back to Valor. Could this happen again in another human? The old physician did not answer immediately. Under controlled replication? He said at last. Perhaps. Under identical conditions? Impossible. The trauma threshold alone should have rendered the question irrelevant. Yet it did not. No. Elira's gaze sharpened, which means this is not singular because it is impossible. It is singular because no one survived long enough to force knowledge. No one in the room disputed that. Jonah felt the sentence settle heavily in him. Not singular miracle. Singular evidence. There was a difference. And evidence always attracted empires. Cirrus folded her hands before her. Majesty, I advise strict containment, Maven said. I advise layered containment and scenario modeling. If the creed even suspects the biological implications, they will escalate. Nicera added, training and movement restrictions tighten now. Kayla said, and if anyone outside sealed command so much as whispers compatibility within earshot of an unstable house scion, I begin breaking fingers. No one appeared to find this disproportionate. Elira turned again to Jonah. What do you advise? He laughed once, softly, because apparently being a mechanic was no defense against being asked sovereign questions anymore. You want the opinion of the body attached to the crisis. I do. Jonah looked at the suspended image of his own system pulsing in blue and gold. Then at the faces around him, Cirrus, who wanted to protect knowledge without losing ethics. Valor, who feared wonder becoming exploitation. Nicera, already restructuring risk. Maven, seeing war in the future tense. Kalis, ready to solve ideology through surgical aggression if necessary. And Elira. Always Elira. Watching not only the political ramifications, but the moral shape of what came next. If this gets out too early, Jonah said slowly, the creed turns me into proof of contamination, or proof of theft, or some lab-made abomination story their frightened supporters can hold on to. Maven nodded once. Likely. If you bury it completely, Jonah continued, then if it leaks later, it looks like you were hiding something too dangerous to name. Cirrus's expression darkened. Also likely. Jonah looked at Elira. So for now, he said, you keep the science sealed, but you start preparing the language that will matter when sealing fails. Then Elira asked, and what language is that? Jonah thought of the Ashen Gospel, of blood as destiny, of superiority as theology, of his cells answering a call they were never supposed to hear. And because he had learned from Elira at least this much, he chose the plainest truth. That change doesn't mean corruption, he said. It means life is more connected than fear wants it to be. Silence, deep and complete. Then Valor astonishingly bowed his head. Not deeply, not ceremonially, but enough. Cirrus looked at Jonah with something like wonder stripped of naivete. Nicera exhaled once, as though a line had finally resolved. Maven said, that will threaten them more than any data chart. Kalis added, good. Elira's gaze did not leave Jonah's. No, she said softly, not good. He frowned. Her eyes held old fire. Necessary. That was different. And because it was different, it mattered. The secrecy lasted 6 days, which, under the circumstances, Jonah would later admit was better than Bastion Reach odds. The leak did not come through Cirrus or Valor. Not through the household guard, not through Nicera's command channels, not through Maven's sealed intelligence scaffold. It came through blood. Of course it did. An archive access request flagged by a junior medical scribe, a harmless discrepancy in treatment registry timestamps, a curiosity in one of the old academic houses still tolerated near the sovereign research rings, because its loyalties were ancient enough to be mistaken for harmless tradition. Then, from there, a whisper. Not the data itself, only the shape of it. The human survived too well. The human responds. The human body took night law into itself and did not reject it. By the time Maven intercepted the first echo on a lower court channel, the phrasing had already changed again. The human changes. That was all the Ashen Creed needed. Jonah learned this in Nicera's war room before dawn cycle, with the chamber lights held low and 3 separate intelligence streams burning in the air around them. Maven stood at the central table, one hand braced on its edge. Kalis paced once like a blade, thinking. Nicera had gone so still she looked carved. Elira herself had not yet entered, but her absence felt temporary, not structural. Maven flicked a new line of intercepted text into visibility. If blood can be taught to answer foreign harmonics, then blood can be unmade. Jonah stared at it. There was the new doctrine. No longer merely mercy is weakness. Now change is annihilation. Kalis hissed softly. They are moving faster than projected. Because biology frightens them more than honor ever did, Maven said. Jonah looked up. They can talk around morality. Yes. But if the body doesn't obey their boundaries? Nicera finished for him. Their entire metaphysics begins to fracture. The doors opened. Elira entered with Severin beside her. No preamble. No wasted movement. Maven turned the intercepted lines toward them. Severin read once and swore quietly in a language Jonah still did not know, but had learned to respect as an indicator of real danger. Elira read the text in silence. Then she said, "It begins." No one asked what. They knew. The next war, not only of creed against alliance, but of purity against change, of bloodline dogma against biological witness, of fear against the intolerable possibility that life had never honored the walls ideology demanded of it. Elira looked at Jonah. For one brief second, sovereign calculation fell away and something like sorrow crossed her face. Not for herself, for him. Because his body had now become a frontier others would try to conquer with argument, science, theft, or hate. Then the sorrow vanished into rule. From this moment, she said, Jonah Mercer is no longer simply under bloodward protection. He is under sovereign bioseal. The room tightened. Even Valor, had he been present, would likely have felt the weight of those words. Severin nodded once. I will issue the command. Nicera bowed her head. His perimeter doubles. Maven was already revising outcomes aloud. We must prepare both a counter-theological and scientific response tree. If the creed names him corruption, we answer with witness and controlled evidence. If they attempt doctrinal quarantine language, we force them to over-define. If they call him hybrid. Keelis's eyes turned lethal. Then someone dies. Elira's gaze shifted to her. Not yet. Keelis bowed her head once. As you command. Jonah stood in the middle of it all and felt the strange detachment that sometimes comes when fear finally becomes too large to metabolize directly. Sovereign bioseal. His body had become state matter. He should have found that horrifying. He did find it horrifying. But beneath the horror there was also anger. A hard, clean anger. Because none of this had begun with ambition. It had begun with a child in danger. And yet here it was, as so many human stories had gone before. The body that stood for mercy now made into battleground because hatred could not tolerate evidence of connection. Elira saw something of that in him. She crossed the room and stopped directly before him. They will try to name you wrongly, she said. Jonah looked at her. I figured. They will say you are altered into lesserhood, altered into theft, altered into proof of betrayal. Her voice lowered. Do not let them tell you what change means. He held her gaze. How? Her answer came like iron laid carefully on a wound, by refusing their vocabulary before you refuse their power. The line entered him and stayed. Behind her, the intercepted texts burned cold in the air. Around them, the room moved toward planning, security, counterstrike, doctrine, future damage. But in the center of it all stood Jonah Mercer, mechanic, father, witness, anomaly. Still human, changed. And now dangerous in a way he had never intended to become, because his blood had survived long enough to say something doctrine could not contain. Later, alone in the private stillness of her sanctuary, Elira Valathorn stood before her relic table and understood that history had found its next battlefield. Not market, not court, not even gospel. Flesh. The Ashen Creed would not fear Jonah because he was merely morally inconvenient. They would fear him because the body did not lie as elegantly as ideology. A human lived who had taken Valdir restoration into himself and emerged not erased, not consumed, not reduced, but changed in continuity rather than destruction, connected, not conquered. If that truth matured, purity theology would have to choose: deny evidence and descend into fanatic absurdity, or admit that blood had never been the prison its priests required. Elira touched the cracked clay lamp with one finger. Once, long ago, rulers had burned villages because sickness crossed boundaries. Now others would burn futures because life crossed them too well. The shape changed. The fear remained. She lifted her hand from the lamp and looked at the black mirror. In its depths stood the woman she had become. Behind that, if one knew how to see, the girl she had been. And behind both, perhaps, the generations yet to come, children of blood, of alliance, of science, of courage, of altered possibility. They will not have this frontier either, she said softly. Not as doctrine, not as weapon, not as proof that fear had been right. Then she turned from memory toward war. Because some truths, once embodied, could no longer be defended by sentiment alone. They had to be protected in blood, language, law, and change. And Jonah Mercer, whether he wanted it or not, had become one of those truths.